Hi everyone, Julia here from The Art of Creating, and I'm back again with another watercolor painting tutorial. Today we're painting another sunset, and as always I'm starting by wetting my whole paper with clean water and a clean brush. Just make sure that you wet your paper thoroughly and go over it with a few layers and making sure that your paper is not pooling with water, that everything is evenly wetted. And then I'm starting applying the color, and I'm starting light to dark. With the sunsets, as you would probably notice from the various photos, and if you've painted sunsets before, you will notice that you have your very light colors closer to the sun, which is usually closer to the horizon, and the bottoms of the clouds where it's still lit up by the sun. But the tops of the clouds generally have a very dark color. So we're starting with the lightest colors. We are going to put the yellow down, some oranges and some reds, and I'm going with a fairly light layer for this one. I'm just blocking in the colors and the shapes of the clouds. I'm using the reference photo for this, and I'm just trying to observe carefully where the clouds are, the directions of them, and the shapes, where the colors are, how dark they are, and I'm just trying to block it all in to start with, and then I'm just going to intensify this as I go. You will notice me using the brush in a couple of different ways. So I'm using a flat brush and I'm just doing the nice fluid motion strokes where I'm lifting the brush up as I take it off the paper, just to get those nice wavy lines and thin lines so that it looks softer on the paper. And then I'm also using the wider part of the brush to cover in larger areas as well. So in some areas I will start with the flatter side, and then I will turn the brush sideways as I lift it off the paper, and I will also move my hands very softly to create those kind of not quite random, but those strokes with the paper, those strokes with the paintbrush, so that it's not just lines from left to right, that they have a bit of movement and a bit of a dimension. So I'm going through the paper, watching carefully where my paper is starting to dry, so that I can reapply a bit more water or a bit more paint, making sure that those areas don't get too dry, so that I still got a nice smooth wash and my colors are blending in together. So if I'm seeing that somewhere the paper is starting to dry, I can either just add a little bit more water to it, or just go back into that area with that paint color and add a bit more paint to keep the paper saturated. As I'm watching my reference image, I'm just going over my painting, adding the colors in those sections and sort of trying to define the shapes of the clouds a little bit more. So in the top section, the clouds are much darker, and they've got in the lower part of it, it's got more burgundy color of purple, and the top part is a little bit grayer blue. And as I'm continuing to paint, I'm just adding more vibrant oranges and yellows, just to intensify those colors as I know where they're all going. I'm also adding a few purples and pinks and reds into the areas that are lit up by the sun to create that vibrancy. So, sunsets usually have, well, they always have a lot of bright colors. You might find different variations of it. You might find just some oranges and yellows, and in a painting like this there is quite a wide range of colors, from purples to sort of grayish blues to really bright pinks and oranges and yellows. While my paper is still wet, you will notice that when I apply the color, it starts spreading out. So to make sure that you still have the shapes of the clouds defined, so that they don't all blend into each other, as you apply the different colors, you want to leave a bit of space to allow them to spread out and blend into the neighboring colors. And the colors where you don't want to spread out too much, like for example, you don't want to mix some purples with yellows, or some bluish bluish grays with yellows. You don't want to sort of start creating green colors in there. You need to leave a bit more space. And if you find that your colors are starting to spread out too much, then you can use a clean brush and make sure that there is no excess water in the brush. Just wipe it on the towel like I'm doing here, and you can just clean up those areas if they're starting to blend into the other areas too much, just to keep them separate and keep the colors a little bit brighter and more defined. This middle section of the cloud had a lot more texture and a lot more different lines and shapes and colors in it. So I'm trying to keep those colors a little bit separate because I'm going to need to add a lot more and keep working on that section to create the look that I want. So when I'm finished with the first layer, I need to let it completely dry because I need to, one, assess my colors intensity and the shapes where I've got all the lines and shapes and the color areas to see if I'm happy or if I need to make any adjustments. And then I'm going in with the second layer, and to do that we are going to wet the whole thing with a clean brush and clean water once again, and just with a light touch because we don't want to rub off any color that's underneath or reactivate it too much. So we need to work quite quickly and with a light touch re-wet the whole area. And then I'm going back with the colors that I want to intensify. So that's the yellows and oranges, and I'm going to add a bit more bright pink. So for colors in this painting, I'm using my Winsor & Newton professional paints, and I'm using 100% cotton paper. So for the yellows, I am working with Winsor Lemon, and in some cases I've added a little bit of yellow ochre as well. And I've mixed my own orange using Scarlet Lake and Winsor Lemon, and in some cases Scarlet Lake and yellow ochre. And then for the darks, I've got the ultramarine, French ultramarine and Payne's grey. And just depending on whether I want a bit more red in it or not, I've been using some permanent carmine. And for the really bright pink areas, I've added a little bit of Opera Rose. That's a really nice bright pink. And I just wanted a few of those highlights to have that pop of pink there, just to add a bit more variation and interest in my painting. As usual, the thing that needs fixing in the painting the most, especially in the subsequent layers, because the first layer is usually never dark enough, is it's the darkest colors. In the case of this painting, it's the purples in the clouds. So as I'm going over the painting, trying to intensify my yellows and oranges, of course I also need to go back with a fair bit of purple and blue colors and intensify that top section. I'm also using my brush on the side to create those wavy motions to indicate the cloud movement and to make it more dimensional. I'm going to go over those sections quite a bit. The lower sections have a bit more purple with red in them, and the lower you go, the more red is in the clouds. And the top parts have a lot more blue and Payne's grey in them. So I'm going through it quite a fair bit, working sort of around the painting as a whole, just making sure that any sections don't dry that I still want to work on, so that then I don't start creating blooms and hard edges, which then is harder to fix, at least in this layer, and I would then need to work on it again as I do the subsequent layers as well if I want to. So of course in this part I also didn't have my darks as dark as I wanted to, so I've let it dry once again to reassess how much more paint I need to add and in which sections. So I'm pretty happy with the yellows and oranges in this case, but I want to focus on my darks. And because I want the colors all to blend in smoothly, I don't want the hard transitions and edges in my clouds in the dark section. I need to re-wet the whole thing once again. And I just added a bit of yellow under that middle cloud so that it looks a little bit more like it's glowing. If I'm seeing that my colors are spreading out too much, I'm wiping my brush and cleaning it with water, and then making sure that it's wiped down on the towel and doesn't have any excess water. And then I'm just going to clean up those edges that are starting to spread out too much. At some point I've had to let it dry just a little bit so that it's not completely dry, but it's still got a bit of moisture in the paper so that it stops spreading out into the sections that I want to sort of keep as cleaner sections of lines of different colors. And I'm just going to add those darks and lines of my reds and purples so that they don't spread out too much. And that's a dangerous part because you need to do it at the right time when your colors are still wet. They are not drying up, so that the edges are still blending out and are still a little bit smooth. However, they are not spreading out into the nearby areas and keeping their shape. So in other words, you only have a short window of time to do that, and you need to keep an eye on it as well. And it's only really something that you can do in a smaller section, because then if you've missed your chance, that section will dry and you need to then re-wet the whole area once again and wait for the right time to add your colors. And at this stage you can play around with the colors a little bit, just making sure that you've got your shapes of the clouds, how you want them, whether they're dark enough. You can create some more movements in the clouds with your brush, just making it look like the wind is blowing the clouds across the sky, and it creates a bit more interest and makes the painting a bit more dynamic. And once you have finished with your sky portion, you need to let it dry, and then we can work on the mountains. So the reason why we need to let it dry is once we start painting the mountains, our dark colors will start blending and bleeding into the yellow, and those colors will then create an undesirable color. And we want to keep our yellows very nice and bright. We don't want them mixed with any darker colors and lose that vibrancy. So we need to make sure that our painting dries before we start working on our mountains. For the mountains, I'm using the same mixture, just a bit more red and a bit more Payne's grey in it to make them a bit darker than the clouds. And the tops of the mountains are also a little bit darker than the middle section. And to do that, I've sort of gone over it a couple of times, just adding a bit more color to them, but while the whole thing is still wet so that it blends in and you don't get that line of dark colors versus the rest of the mountains. And then I've just added a few more lines of darker colors throughout the mountains, just to sort of create a bit more texture and dimension on the mountains themselves. And there's nothing else really to it. It's a fairly simple wash. It's just like a dark silhouette in the shadow. And once I do this layer, I'm not going to go back with another one. This color mix is fairly dark, but if your painting is not as dark as you wanted it to be, you can just go over it a second time with the colors again and just adding some darker colors. You just need to re-wet that section carefully. You don't need to re-wet the whole painting unless you wanted to. Just keeping in mind that if you go over it again and you re-wet the whole painting, you don't want your mountains to blend into the sun, into the yellows. So just be careful if you're doing that. But that's it for our painting. I hope you enjoyed it and you can have a go at it yourself. Let me know if you've got any questions, and if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like that, subscribe to my channel and click like. And if you've got any questions or suggestions for future videos, leave me a comment and let me know. I will see you in the next one.